Look, this administration has shown us since day one they don't care what science experts have to say about anything involving science. They would rather trust people like Tony, who base their entire knowledge of science based on page 1 of the Bible.
But Hemant, your genitalia, the way you're born, your sex does kind of tell you your gender. Isn't that scientific, Tony Perkins?
That is the least nuanced perspective you could possibly take on this issue.
Look, listen, this is what happens when people can't defend their position. They begin attacking the opposition. Look, the reality is that we base law and policy on fact, on science, on biology, not subjective feelings. And what the Trump administration is doing here is reestablishing what was in place for probably 50 years through the 1964 and 72 Non-Discrimination Acts, where sex is based on biology, not on the subjective new definition of gender. Well, then
if this administration cares about science, they should talk to the people who study this stuff for a living. Well, they should look at organizations that know this information.
If that's
Nature
true,
magazine,
then the facts would be on the side of Nature magazine.
Yeah, Nature magazine is a magazine. Here, it's not the people who do this for a living.
I don't need an education on science from someone who is known for rejecting it all the time.
Well, when you look down and see what your kid is born with, that's pretty biological and scientific to me. I think we can make a ruling. Gentlemen, thank you. Wish we had all day.
Nature magazine is just a magazine. Yeah, it's the official magazine of Nature Research, the publishers of Nature Journal, one of, if not the most highly regarded peer-reviewed scientific journal that exists. To sneer that it's, quote, just a magazine, as if it were on par with an agony aunt column in something you'd pick up in a dentist's waiting room, reveals an immense degree of ignorance and professional incompetence, or worse, deliberate misportrayal and lack of honesty on part of the sneerer. So for those who haven't yet seen the segment and don't know what I'll be responding to today, we'll be taking a look at Hemant Mehta's Fox News appearance with Tony Perkins. Tony Perkins being the president of the Christian Family Research Council, a Christian hate group designed to impose Christian Sharia as an attempt to eradicate LGBT+ individuals from society, as well as strip women, trans men, and non-binary folk with wombs of their bodily autonomy, and turn them into biological birthing vats. Just a little more background on Perkins. As of 2017, it's also come to light that Tony Perkins knew that Wes Goodman, a fellow Republican, had sexually assaulted an 18-year-old man. Perkins removed his public support from said candidate without comment, yet did nothing such as report the incident to the police. This fact came to light after Goodman, as with so many preachers who attack LGBT+ individuals, was involved with an entirely separate scandal involving sex in public office with another man. I need to point this out because of the entirely misleading name of the Christian Family Research Council. At least according to myself, turning a blind eye to sexual assault by fellow colleagues is not a healthy family value. The segment I'm using was uploaded to Hemant's channel and is titled, "Here's my Fox News segment about how we find meaning in life outside of religion." It doesn't actually start on the topic seen in the opening, that came up later on. The original topic, as the title suggests, was the way in which less people find meaning in religion, with only about 20% saying such, whilst 69% chose family. There were a few points that Hemant couldn't address due to the heavy time limitations of being on Fox News, not to mention not having access to the internet to check what Mr. Perkins was saying. So my corrections come as no judgment to him, he was just doing the best he could in the situation. So let's get to it.
With the holiday season in full swing, Pew Research asked, where do you find your meaning in life? According to this research study, the majority of Americans, 69%, say family. Surprisingly, faith comes fourth at 20%. Joining me now to discuss is Family Research Council President Tony Perkins and Hemant Mehta, who is the editor of Friendly Atheist. Thank you both for being here. Your reaction to this, I want to start with you, Tony. Does this bespeak a dwindling of faith that we see God and faith as a meaning of life dwindling, sinking in the polls?
Actually, Raymond, I'm thrilled by this, that family is so high ranked in this survey, that people say that family is where they get their sense of meaning. That's actually a positive revival of family, if you will. I think if you look at how the United States, how the economy is doing in the United States, unemployment is low. It's not surprising that religion actually drops down lower in this list. It's still fourth. That's actually still pretty good, considering what's happening in other industrialized nations. When there's a downturn in the economy, when things start to fall apart, that's when people turn to religion. So from a sociological standpoint, I think this is accurate. From a theological standpoint, it is a bit troubling.
So I'd just like to pause here to look into Perkins' claims that holding to religious source meaning, what I'll be referring to as religiosity in relation to this segment, that said religiosity increases as financial security decreases or, quote, things start to fall apart, end quote, as Perkins puts it. Now the survey did include employment, but only as part of a general topic relating to one's career. However, they did divide respondents into high, mid, and low income. High refer to those who earned more than $75,000 per annum, low to those who earned less than $30,000 per annum, with mid being everything in between. Now, if what Perkins says has merit, we'd expect to see that those who earn less than $30,000 to have higher religiosity. Yet this is not the case. Instead, what we do find is, quote, there are several sources of meaning that are mentioned much more often by Americans with high incomes and levels of education attainment than by those with lower incomes and less education. For instance, the open-ended question finds that higher levels of education and income are associated with increased likelihood that a respondent will cite friendships and good health. Furthermore, high levels of education also are associated with mentioning a sense of security or stability and recreational activities as key sources of meaning and fulfillment. Conversely, there are few topics that those with lower levels of income and education mention more often than others. Taken together, these findings suggest that those respondents who are socioeconomically advantaged may have resources, like free time to spend with friends or money to pursue opportunities to travel, that those who are less socioeconomically privileged simply do not have. End quote. Beyond that, the only thing it goes on to specifically list as being mentioned more frequently by low income than high income are health difficulties. But whilst not economically, religiosity is notably impacted by age, ethnicity, marital status, political alignment, and perhaps unsurprisingly, religious affiliation. But not financial security. Nowhere is that even hinted at, which one would expect such a survey to mention, along with the rest of the traits just listed. Socioeconomic status is one of the major qualities such surveys look at, but they didn't find a notable difference worth mentioning. So in relation to what this survey studied and its sample, Perkins' claim doesn't hold water. It doesn't explain the data we see here.
Hemant, your reaction?
Yeah, I agree. It should be troubling for religion. It doesn't surprise me one bit that people find meaning in family and experiences. And what actually surprised me the least about this is when they looked at young people specifically, I think faith became less of a meaningful experience for people who were younger than the age of 30. So it shows that faith has a lot of trouble moving ahead in the future, regardless of what the economic situation or social situation is in.
Well, Tony, you react to this, but Hemant, all the studies I've seen, faith is something that usually comes to people as they age in life, as they encounter challenges, and they deepen their understanding of the world and kind of get out of themselves. Right, Tony?
Raymond, what Jesus taught in Matthew 6 was seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. That's what I was referring to from a theological standpoint, because when you set your eyes on the things on this earth, you miss the bigger things. And as you live for those things that are transcendent, then all the other things fall into place. But it is interesting when you look at the age, as people get older and they start dealing with the real issues of life and considering what happens after this life, and there is more of a turn toward religion because they want to make sure they make that right decision.
Well,
the first thing that cried out to me here is the way in which both the host and Perkins' response here seems to be relying on a simple distortion on two fronts, warping what we actually see into something completely detached from our observations. The first distortion comes in the way that both the host and Perkins try to forward the idea that this generational drop in the importance of religion is somehow balanced out by an aging increase in said perceived importance of religion. Pretty much, the generational change can be ignored, due to the aging change in the opposition, a topic which we'll delve into later as both parties elaborate on this line of thought in a second. But first I wanted to deal with the second distortion. That is that most young people go out in life, learn more, move beyond the individual, and become religious. This entirely fabricated and frankly patronizing description of what we do observe with the aging change needs to be challenged. It's true, the number of religious people in any given generation increases as that generation ages, but this is not some massive shift, nor is it a shift made as a result of bettering knowledge and/or perspective, and to validate that, I bring forward what is known as the 4 to 14 window. This 4 to 14 window is the basis of the child evangelism movement, began as far back as 1937 and consolidated in 1997 with the publishing of The Great Commission to Reach a New Generation inside the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology. The article had looked into the ages of conversion and had found that 71% of all converts to Christianity had done so before they reached 15 years of age, with another 10% having converted before they reached their 20s, leaving only 19% who had come to Christianity aged 20 or over. Thus the 4 to 14 window was born, 4 being the age at which a child is capable of grasping abstracts such as the existence of a deity, 14 being the age at which teenagers' minds start to become critical of what they're taught. It discovered that Christianity's survival is predicated on parasitically infecting young people, those who lack sufficient tools to apply proper scrutiny to the claims made by Christianity. Like a pathogen, it is reliant on the host having a compromised immune system, in this case the absence of philosophical frameworks, in order to propagate. That's why state-church separation in school is so important, to protect the vulnerable. It also explains why so many Christians are willing to flaunt, to break, to violate said secular law. They do so because the state-church separation is starving their religion of easy targets. Once a person reaches relative maturity, converting them becomes far more difficult. So it's not the case of lived experience brings people to religion, quite the opposite. An adult who's not been raised to give religion special exemption from scrutiny is a hard mark indeed. In conclusion, what we observe is the complete opposite to what both the host and Mr. Perkins forward. Maturity isn't the basis for religion, it's the death of it. A lot of people who are indoctrinated during the 4 to 14 window remain religious, whilst a few more join them later in life. Why? Well, there are many reasons forwarded, such as increasing proximity to death, extra time in retirement being filled with activities involving a religious community due to the absence of secular alternatives, and the sudden discovery of alternative religions or spiritual beliefs one may not have been raised in the knowledge of. That latter one is particularly interesting, since we do find that more recent generations are turning away from organized religions, such as the Abrahamic monotheisms like Christianity, to adopt more spiritual and pragmatic religions. But this age effect on religious beliefs is completely dwarfed by the generational effect, something we'll go on to discuss in the next segment.
Those people who said that faith was important to them, it was the most meaningful thing in their life, so they feel it deeply, and that was an interesting part of that survey.
That was a small group of people. That was a small group of people, and again, when so many young people are finding more value in people they love and the ability to make the most of the one life that they have, they're not going to resort to religion later in life. That's a very optimistic spin that has no bearing in reality.
That's been a progression for decades, and it's not a small percentage. Would you look at black and white Protestants, it's 6 out of 10 say religion is the top issue for them. Conservatives, same thing. The divide is really, it's ideological.
So Hemant's comments, which are still in relation to the previous point, fly right over Perkins' head, once again being brushed aside as if this generational drop is something that can be ignored because age and generation plays no factor. It's now ideological apparently. By the way, ethnicity is not an ideology. It is true there is a conservative-liberal divide, but that's not where this change is coming from. So let's deal with the generational versus aging effect and its relation to the conversation about religion in general. We'll move away from talking about religion as the source of importance to just being religious or believing in a god, since that's the data I have to work with. No matter how you cut it, the national average of both religious beliefs and theism is falling. Now, digging a little deeper reveals that not only does the age effect on both religiosity and theism not explain said change, but in actual fact it shoots both the host and Perkins in the foot in making it far worse. Why? Well, averages of averages. What do I mean? Well, as one generation shrinks, its impact on the national average in relation to the average of that generation will also shrink. Because even if the average for that generation remains roughly the same, they are a smaller part of the national average, which diminishes the effect they have on said national average. And here's a fun fact. America has an aging population. The number of young people is shrinking proportionally when compared to the number of old people. This is happening for two main reasons. Reason 1. The true fertility rate has dropped below the replacement rate. Reason 2. Thanks to medical advances, people are living longer on average. Starting with number 1. The total fertility rate, also known as the TFR, for the US is 1.7655 as of 2017. What that means is that for every 1,000 women, trans men, and non-binary persons with a womb in the United States of America, there are roughly 1,765.5 new births during their lifetime. For a true replacement rate, you require a TFR of around 2.1, so 2,100 new births for every 1,000 women et alia. But as I've just noted, we're not seeing that, meaning that the base of what was once the population pyramid is no longer growing. In fact, it's shrinking as even immigrants from nations with higher TFRs typically lose their higher average across 2 generations. Meanwhile, as noted, the older generations are starting to fill in as more and more people live to be 60, 80, and so on, which tells us something about the generational decrease we're seeing. For the argument both the host and Perkins raised to have any sort of merit as a response, the TFR would have to be higher than the replacement rate, resulting in a larger child and then young adult population, which could in theory disproportionately drag the national average closer to the side of the irreligious and atheist. But that's not what's happening, rather the opposite. A disproportionate older population is actually dragging the national average towards religion and theism. And yet in spite of said proportional-based distortion, the generational effect still systematically decreases the national average on both fronts, meaning that even with those 19% later converts, it's not enough to stop the religious decline in the United States of America.
But I would say that the one thing that is encouraging, again, going back to this, it's a time to be happy and to
Very
come
quickly,
together,
Tony, because I got another topic.
Family is top priority, and that's a good thing.
I want to get your
thing.
thoughts on this, gentlemen. Nature magazine, the prestigious science magazine, came out against President Trump's proposal to identify sex based on strictly biological criteria. Nature tweeted this. Editorial, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services proposes to establish a legal definition of whether someone is male or female based on the genitals they were born with. This proposal has no foundation in science and should be abandoned. Really? Hemant, I'll give you first crack at that. You think it should be abandoned?
Look, this administration has shown us since day one they don't care what science experts have to say about anything involving science. They would rather trust people like Tony, who base their entire knowledge of science based on page 1 of the Bible.
But Hemant, your genitalia, the way you're born, your sex does kind of tell you your gender. Isn't that scientific, Tony Perkins?
That is the least nuanced perspective you could possibly take on this issue.
Listen, this is what happens when people can't defend their position. They begin attacking the opposition. Look, the reality is that we base law and policy on fact, on science, on biology, not subjective feelings. And what the Trump administration is doing here is reestablishing what was in place for probably 50 years through the 1964 and 72 Non-Discrimination Acts, where sex is based on biology, not
We learn
on the
more as
subjective
time
new
goes
definition of
on.
gender. Well, then
If
let
this
Congress
administration
change
cares
it.
about science, they should talk to the people who study this stuff for a living.
Well,
They should look
then
at
that's fine. If
organizations
that's
that know this
true,
information.
If
Well,
that's
Nature
true,
magazine-
then the facts would be on the side of Nature magazine.
Yeah,
If the
Nature
facts
magazine is
were
a
on the side
magazine.
here,
It's not the people who do this for a
I
living.
don't need an education on science from someone who is known for rejecting it all the time.
Well, when you look down and see
Talk
what
to
your kid is
Congress.
born with, that's pretty biological and scientific to me. I think we can make a ruling. Gentlemen, thank you. Wish we had all day.
Now, I've already taken to town the host's professional competence on referring to Nature magazine as just a magazine, devoid of the context that it's the official magazine for one of the most trusted, peer-reviewed scientific journals out there. But let's address what's being stated here. First of all, Trump's administration never drew upon science, outdated or updated. Intersex conditions have been known to exist for centuries, so the idea that biology has boiled sex down to genitals at any point in recent history is a gross misrepresentation of the facts. We've known about the complexities of the human sex mosaic for a long time. We just simplify it for school children, as we do with every other aspect of science. I could try explaining baryon acoustic oscillations to a child or a young teen, but they're likely going to give me a blank stare. There are numerous traits involved with sex, each with its own scale or boxes to be ticked for. This includes genitalia, hormones, gametes, internal organs, chromosomes, and secondary sexual features. I could then go on to explain how nobody is perfectly male or perfectly female. I could also go on to explain how the brain, which is the source of conscious thought, is also a physical aspect of a person's body and also relates to sex differentiation. But again, we're talking about students and what they're taught as a simplified version. What actually matters is what the science of this field tells us, which was the basis for the statement put out there by Nature magazine. As they said, there is nothing scientific about the Trump administration's maintained violence against the trans community, nor is there anything scientific about either the host of the segment or Perkins. There's just unending and entirely willful ignorance on the subject. And I say willful for one very important fact. The tweet was linked to an article which explained all of this. It even explained how the majority of children reassigned female as infants later came out and had to transition to male. Why? Because you can't change a person's gender. It's impossible. A fact agreed upon by the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the UK Council for Psychotherapy, and the World Psychiatric Association, to name a few. By the way, this is something which does not happen to trans children. Young trans people are allowed to socially transition and are given fully reversible and medically safe puberty blockers after the early stages of puberty set in, allowing doctors to extend the decision period into their late or mid-teens. This is a process taken to ensure that the right decision is made for that teenager, and is thus in no way comparable to the fuck-up resulting from religious genital mutilation of infants. One is about care, the other is unsafe child branding, excused under religious practice. I will end here with a quote from said article, which reads as follows, quote, "Political attempts to pigeonhole people have nothing to do with science and everything to do with stripping away rights and recognition from those whose identity does not correspond with outdated ideas of sex and gender. It is an easy way for the Trump administration to rally its supporters, many of whom oppose equality for people from sexual and gender minorities. It is unsurprising that it appeared just weeks before the midterm elections. This is not the first time that the administration has attacked legal protections for transgender and non-binary people. Last year, Trump declared that transgender people would no longer be allowed to serve in the US military, and rescinded guidelines suggesting that schools should let pupils use a lavatory of their choice. An October 2017 memo from the US Department of Justice stated that laws prohibiting employment discrimination should not apply to gender identity. instituting a policy with a narrow definition of sex or gender and no basis in science would be a major step backwards for the United States in gender identity issues. Sadly, the move is only the latest in a series of proposals that misuse and ignore science and harm marginalized groups as part of a quest to score cheap political points." End quote. And I think that really says it all. Hemant did his best given such a short time to make his case. But beyond that, what can one expect from faux news and people such as Tony Perkins? After all, truth is as strange to them as the whole notion of integrity. Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, John Schoenrock, Alexander Williams, Ernst Puna, and Daniel Martinez. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years, and really is the only thing that manages to keep the channel afloat. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook and Twitter. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, an organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's keep this space one which upholds the humanist values. Thank you.